Good afternoon and welcome to the ALCTS webinar, Archival Materials Using RDA with DACS. I'm your host, Jane Rosario, and I'm a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee. Our presenter today is Cory Nimer. Cory is a manuscripts cataloger and metadata specialist at Brigham Young University, where he is responsible for cataloging archival materials. He is currently serving as co-chair of the Standards Committee for the Society of American Archivists. If you have questions for Cory, please type them into the question box on your screen and Cory will answer them at the end of his presentation. If we run out of time, Cory will answer your questions offline and they will be sent to you. Also, please note that you may use Twitter to communicate with other audience members during the presentation using hashtag ALCTSCE shown at the top of this slide. Today's session will be recorded, and you will receive an email with a link to the recording shortly after the conclusion of the webinar. A copy of Cory's slides will also be provided. There may be a slight delay as I turn the presentation over to Cory.
All right. Well, as Jane's already done my introduction, but just to go over it again, my name is Cory Nimer. I'm a manuscripts cataloger at Brigham Young University. BYU was one of the RDA test sites, and so we've been able to use RDA with archives for some time now. My primary responsibility is cataloging for university archives and our historical manuscripts collection, although I also do the motion picture archives, folklore, and photographs. As Jane also mentioned, I'm currently serving as one of the co-chairs of the Society of American Archivists Standards Committee, but I'd like to make clear that in making this presentation today, I'll be speaking from my own experience during the RDA test, and that I'm not speaking on behalf of SAA or the Standards Committee as such. The views and opinions that I'll be sharing with you today are merely my own. SAA, for its part, has not made an official response at this time to RDA. In the webinar last week, it was pointed out that RBMS has made a statement on the use of descriptive cataloging for raw materials books use with RDA. SAA has made no such statement, and so it's been left up to institutions to figure out how to implement RDA with DACS. I do hope that in the future there will be guidelines and best practices developed and made available so that catalogers will have a better idea of how to use these two standards together. For today's presentation, I'd like to really just do an overview of how you would use RDA with DACS for creating descriptions of aggregates, of archival aggregates, or collections based on archival principles. For this, I'll be using RDA as the base set of rules, using DACS as supplementary guidance and interpretation, and hopefully it'll be clear why this approach was taken. It's probably worth mentioning that as of 2010, MARBI had made a change in the bibliographic format to allow subfield E of the 040 field to be repeated, opening up the possibility of creating this sort of hybrid record using principles of both RDA and DACS in this particular case. So a little bit of background quickly. AACR2 came out in 1978 and included a chapter on manuscripts, which presumably was intended to include archival material. However, the archival community immediately rejected that and went about developing its own content standards. Archives, Personal Papers, and Manuscripts, or APPM, was released in 1983, and then the MARC format for recording that information was also released that year. It wasn't until 1993, however, that a model for archival description based on archival principles was released. This was the General International Standard Archival Description, or ISAD-G, which covered descriptions of archival materials, and its companion standard, the International Standard Archival Authority Record for Corporate Bodies, Persons, and Families, which was released in 1996. DACS itself then is meant to be an implementation of that archival model described in ISAD-G and ISAR-CPF. DACS was released in 2004 by the Society of American Archivists and is meant to be a set of output neutral rules that can be used with MARC and EAD for recording information about archives, archival materials, as well as their creators. So going back and looking at the connection then between DACS and RDA, as RDA was being developed, knowing that archivists had been dissatisfied with the Chapter 4 rules of AACR2, the Joint Steering Committee looked at ways to integrate descriptive rules based on coming from the archival community into RDA. And the basis for a lot of that work was DACS, which had just recently come out. Those proposals came from the Library of Congress. However, during the process of integrating the rules into RDA, the rules were oftentimes simplified and made more generic so that they could be applied by archivists, not just in the US, but in other international communities. One of the other changes made from the original proposal from LC was the removal of much of the discussion about archival principles. So in the end, what's ended up in DACS, or what's ended up in RDA from DACS, is a more generic model and one that in some ways is missing the context for explaining how they might be applied. So the rules are there, but one of the other problems with the rules as they exist in RDA right now is just the fact that RDA and DACS in the end are based on two very different conceptual models. So while, as it says in RDA 0.2, there's been an attempt to align archival standards with RDA. In some ways, that's easier said than done. The biggest problem, or the biggest hurdle for archivists trying to use RDA, and in some cases, librarians trying to use RDA with DACS, centers around the FRBR Group 1 entities. The diagram on the left on the right is from FRBR, showing the familiar work, expression, manifestation, item model for describing materials, while the diagram on the left on your screen is from ISAD-G. Some of the obvious differences is the fact that the ISAD-G model is based on an assumption of hierarchical levels of description, but also each of those component descriptions from the phones down to the item is based on an assumption of a unique singular item. And so applying FRBR principles to archival materials ends up being somewhat difficult, especially when you get down to a manifestation item level where, again, with unique materials, there isn't, in some cases, a very good division between those two. So archives, in the end, the archival rules are in there, and it's left to the archivist to make, or the librarian doing archival cataloging, to make sense of how you would apply those, that model and those principles. The glossary does include a brief definition of what archives are, which is a fairly good definition, pointing out the organic nature of archives is something that's produced in the conduct of affairs of a person, family, or an organization. It also points out that archival resources exist at various levels of aggregation, from a large collection down to an individual item. But archival description is really based on the idea of provenance, documenting provenance and the origins of materials. And so applying those rules again, as we'll see later on, it's not just applying the model and applying these principles, but it's also documenting relationships as part of that. So today, I'd like to go briefly through the bibliographic and authority components of RDA. I'll be talking about core or minimal elements. As you know, RDA includes a set of core elements, and for archival materials, it's those listed at the top, from title proper through to creator relationships. But DACS also includes a set of minimal requirements, much of which overlaps with the RDA Core, but those elements that weren't included in RDA Core have been included under the DACS minimal requirements. Name and location of repository through language and scripts material. So I'll be going through each of those briefly. Again, looking at these rules first with the RDA guidelines for how that would be done, and then looking at how the DACS rules could be used to supplement RDA, either with more specific guidance about how that element ought to be used, or providing additional options for recording that information. It's worth pointing out too, though, at the beginning, that in making these descriptions, we'll be able to take our information from a broader range of sources than with traditional monograph cataloging. Archives don't typically come with a title page or a printed description of themselves as part of the resource. And so in recording or in gathering information for making an archival description, we'll be pulling that information either from materials that make up part of the resource, or from other sources of information. Those provisions are included, as it states, in RDA 2.2.2.4 and 2.2.4. For archival aggregates, also as part of 2.4, those resources are assumed not to have a preferred source of information. And so when you're recording a device title or other information, that does not need to be indicated. It doesn't need to be indicated that that is being pulled from outside the resource. And so the use of brackets, as described in DACS, brackets are not part of a typical archival description, even though most of the information is being supplied by the cataloger. So the first element on the RDA Core list is the title proper. Again, since most of these resources won't come with a title, the cataloger is instructed to provide a devised title. And RDA lists a few different options for how that can be recorded. That title could be either a term that describes the nature of the resource, a term related to the subject of the resource, or a combination of the two. And we'll see in a minute what those would look like. For archival materials, RDA 2.3.2.11.4 also allows you to record the name of the creator, the collector, or the source of the materials, although this is, again, listed as just another option in how you might put together a device title. The rules also, the RDA rules also state that the language should be typically in the language and script of the materials themselves. So looking at some examples, again, if we had a photograph of Mount Timpanogos in Utah, you could use the option of recording just the nature of the resource. In that first example, photographs, the subject of the photographs could be recorded as the title, Mount Timpanogos, Utah. The combination of the two, photographs of Mount Timpanogos, Utah, or following the archival option that was allowed, recording the creator as part of that. So Eugene L. Roberts' photographs of Mount Timpanogos, Utah. Now, using DACS in conjunction with RDA, again, RDA provides this wide variety of options for recording a title. In this case, DACS provides more specific guidelines of how you would put that together. According to DACS 2.3, the required elements of the title include that name segment listing the creator or collector of the material and the nature of the material segment. So photographs from our previous example. The topical segment of the title can also be included, as we saw in RDA, but that is now, according to DACS, an optional element. In addition to providing more specific guidance on which elements are required in an archival title, DACS provides information on how to record the creator in terms of the number of creators that might be included in a title, the number of or different types of materials that should be listed for the materials, nature of material segment, as well as other rules for making determinations on which creators should be recorded. So looking back at those examples again now, according to the DACS rules in DACS 2.3, that first example are the required elements of the creator and the type of material. Or you could have that longer string with the name, the type of material, and the subject. But those earlier RDA options that we saw of just the type of material or just the subject of the material are no longer allowed when using RDA in conjunction with DACS. The last example there with the type of material and the subject might be possible if you didn't know who the photographer was according to DACS, but again, typically an archival title according to DACS needs to include the creator of the materials as part of the title. The next element is data production. RDA includes production date as part of 2.7 as part of the production statement. However, of the three elements that make up the production statement, only the data production is required. The other two components of that are optional and may be useful to be recorded for an individual manuscript, but again, for archival materials would be less common to use. So the specific rules for recording that information are provided in RDA 2.7.6.7. This section includes specific guidance on how to record a single date, how to record a span of dates, how to record bulk dates, what to record in the case where dates aren't provided, either through estimating dates or recording the statement data production not identified. Looking at some examples of how that works, and not instead of looking at the specific rules, looking at examples, we can see that for a single date, it asks for either the year or a more specific date within that year, although it doesn't provide guidance on how that date should specifically be formulated. Inclusive dates are just a closed range from the earliest date to the latest date of the material, and so on. Looking at this, and again, one of the other changes, though, that is included for this section in RDA are some changes in mark mapping. Traditionally, for archival materials, the date was recorded as part of the 245 field in subfield F, as in that first example of the Thomas Jones papers. According to the mappings provided in RDA, however, that date field, or that date element, has now been moved out of the title and is recorded in a 260, mark 260 subfield C. That now seems to be in transition and moving toward using the 264, allowing us to more specifically designate that field as being a production statement date. But as of right now, the 260 mapping is still the current mapping in RDA. And again, a departure from traditional archival cataloging practice. Looking at how the supplementary rules provided by DACS. DACS in section 2.4 somewhat broadens the definition of dates that should be recorded in this field to include not just creation and record keeping, but also publishing and broadcast. Again, if we were looking at this in terms of the 264 field, we would be able to specify what type of date that was using that. But for materials that are being treated archivally, again, it can be in any format. And so the archival rules were meant to be broadened that way. At the same time, the DACS guidelines provide more specific information on how to record those dates, specifying the format of single year or single date entries, providing specific guidance for materials that have ongoing accruals, and for recording the dates for materials that might have a gap, so that where recording an inclusive date span might be somewhat deceiving for a researcher. So looking at this again, DACS provides more specific information, looking at the single dates examples in date format, asking for a year, month, day instead of allowing for the variety of entries that might be permitted under RDA. It also includes requirements to have a closed date span for a description, not leaving an open date span, and then being able to record multiple date spans to describe materials that might have a gap in their content. The next element is the identifier. Identifier of manifestation is required by RDA. However, this again is one of those examples of where the FRBR model doesn't necessarily tie in very well to the archival model. The manifestation rules, the rules for recording manifestation identifiers are provided in RDA 2.15, but most of those are aimed at standard numbers such as ISBNs or ISSNs, where you have an identifier that could describe a wide range of material. Archival materials, again, often only exist in one aggregation, and so they won't have that sort of standard number. RDA provides separate rules, though, in 2.19 for identifiers specific to a particular item. And so looking at how those work, so looking at the rules in that section, it requires basically that the name of the repository be recorded as well as the local identifier. The DACS rules are probably more similar to that local identifier example. In DACS 2.1, the two types of identifiers that are required are a local identifier and a repository identifier. Although looking at some examples from DACS, those get recorded slightly differently than in the format that's described in RDA. An RDA collection call number, again, would be somewhat more similar to this first example, with the name of the repository and then its local identifier, where DACS, the archival practice encoded in, or described in DACS, leans more toward just having a local identifier and then assuming that the institution that's doing the cataloging is the holder of that group of material. So using the 040 subfield A for the repository code. This again may be an area, it's probably an area where best practices need to evolve, or more specific guidelines be introduced for how to record this information. The ISO recently put out a new standard for the International Standard Collection Identifier, or ISCI. It may be that identifier scheme will also inform how this evolves over time. But again, right now there's some divergence between these two sets of rules on how to record a collection call number or an identifier for the manifestation or item. The next core element in RDA is carrier type. RDA 3.3 calls for the recording of this information and provides a set list of terms that can be recorded. In those guidelines, catalogers are asked to record as many terms as applicable, but given the option of recording only the predominant type of material included or represented. With archives, because you're dealing with an aggregate of material that may have a variety of material types, in some cases it may be better to take the alternative rather than providing an exhaustive list of all the different material types that might be represented in a collection. The next element is extent. RDA provides a variety of options for recording this element. The three listed there being recording the number of items, containers, or volumes in RDA 3.4.1.11.1, recording the amount of storage space required, usually in terms of linear or cubic feet or cubic meters, with an option to record it in feet if desired, or recording the number and type of units included in the collection. So some examples of how this might look. Again, looking at our three options of items, storage space, and the number and type of units, and leaving it up to the institution to decide what their own practice is going to be. Again, looking at the examples on storage space, those have been recorded in terms of linear feet based on the LC policies, based on the option in RDA. The LC policy statement for that section, 3.4.1.11.2, calls for their own use of imperial measurements, inches, cubic inches, feet, or linear feet, although other libraries can, again, make their own decisions on how they're going to implement that section. Looking at DACS, again, the rules are fairly similar. DACS 2.5.4 provides the main options for recording extent, and those break down into the same categories: linear feet or shelf space, the number of items, or the number of containers or carriers. However, DACS does provide some more specific guidelines that broaden the options for archivists recording this information. 2.5.7 has the provisions for parallel statements of extent, 258 for multiple statements of extent, and 2.5.9 for approximate statements of extent. A lot of these, again, are things that are allowed under RDA. Actually, all of these are allowed under RDA, but DACS provides more specific guidance on how to use those and when it would be good to use them. So looking back at those same examples, the first example of 6 boxes includes a parallel statement of extent based on the DACS provisions, as well as the last example for the 400 photographs and 2 linear feet. The last core element required by RDA is that creator relationships be established between the body of material being described and its creator. RDA includes a fairly broad definition of what a creator is: a person, a family, or corporate body responsible for the creation of a work. And a work defined fairly broadly, or relatively broadly, to include compilations as well as integral sorts of works. As far as determining who to create that associate, or what entity to list as a creator, RDA also provides specific rules for corporate bodies for when they should be recorded as creators. And this is basically the same list that was available in AACR2. Those categories are described in RDA 19.2.1.1.1. And looking at some of those categories, Category A is for works of an administrative nature dealing with internal policies or procedures, its staff and officers, or its resources. Category C includes works reporting the collective activity of a conference, an expedition, or an event. Archivists in general tend to take sort of a broad view of what constitutes creators. We'll see in a moment. But even looking at those specific options provided in RDA 19.2, some of those categories should be stretched to include archival materials. So the creator of a body of archival materials in an archive can be associated with those. The rules require that all creators, it provides provisions for all creators to be recorded. However, only the most predominant or the first named creator is required. All other creators can be recorded optionally. Appendix I provides a list of relationship identifiers for making those relationships between a work and a body of material. Although for archives, a lot of them are, again, sort of a stretch for making that connection. Things that might seem obvious exist at a different level. For example, a collector is a relationship identifier that's listed for an item, for the item level, and not at a work level. So if you had a body of material, historical manuscripts or other material that had been brought together by a collector and you were trying to describe according to archival principles, again, it's not really on the list. And so, again, looking at how that might be encoded, in the bibliographic record, the 1XX field is where the creator of the material is linked to the material itself. So the Rose M. Hinton papers has a link or has a 100 field entry for Rose M. Hinton, the Department of History record, 110 to the Department of History heading. Looking at DACS, again, DACS provides a somewhat broader definition of what constitutes a creator, not limiting it to actual creation, but also including assembly, accumulation, maintenance of materials as a creator relationship. Those names some of those names, again, looking back at the titles, will be included in the devised title. But in other cases, names that don't appear in that title can be recorded as creators of those materials. DACS also includes some examples of relationship, what would be sort of the equivalent of a relationship identifiers such as author, collector, artist, cartographer, photographer, as relationships of creation, which, again, looking at Appendix I of RDA can sometimes get a little murky when dealing with archival materials. So in these examples, just using a general creator relationship identifier or designator, even though it's not in the list, in an archival collection, it may be justifiable to use something that's not on the list but fits what the nature of the relationship is between a body of archival materials and their creator, or DACS creator. Moving into the minimal requirements from DACS, those that are in addition to RDA's core requirements. The first of these is the name and location of the repository. This is included in RDA 4.3, which has guidelines, those guidelines there in the middle of the slide, requiring that the name of the repository, including parent bodies, mailing address, and other contact information be recorded. Basically, these are the same rules as you would find in DACS. The main difference between the DACS rules and the RDA rules in this section is the mappings that are provided. RDA Appendix D maps RDA 4.3 to the 270 field, where DACS in its Appendix C maps this to the 852 or the 524 and the location repository or the preferred citation for recording this type of information. Looking at the documentation, the existing documentation in the MARC guidelines, I don't know, the 270 field mapping seemed like an unusual use of the field. Typically that field is used for contact information related to the content of the resource, so publisher information or that type of information rather than the holding repository. But again, this is probably something that needs to be resolved through best practices or other guidelines that might come out in the future. The next element is scope and content. RDA includes 3 elements that cover what the scope content note in DACS deals with. RDA 7.2 includes the nature of the content, 7.3 the coverage of the content, and 7.10 the summarization of the content. Looking at from the examples, those 3 elements in DACS, and it appeared that 7.10, the summarization of the content, was closest to what it was that a scope content note, an archival scope content note would typically include. However, those guidelines, as shown at the bottom of the slide, really focus on content summarization, the content of the material. A scope content note, according to DACS, includes not just the content, but a broader description of the documentary forms that are included in the collection, dates, geographic areas, as well as the functions and activities that generated those materials in the first place. Looking at an example of how that might look, again, this is actually an example that's included in RDA in 7.10, but you can see that it includes that broader list of terms that was included in DACS in that note. And so again, this is another case where using DACS in association with RDA can provide more information for how these descriptions ought to be put together. Conditions governing access, again, is a required note according to DACS, but it is included in RDA. RDA 4.4.1.2 includes, or 4.4.1 includes these guidelines requiring the listing of the nature of the restriction and the duration of the restriction. It also provides the option of recording when there is no restriction on those materials. DACS, though, expands on these guidelines, including additional information on recording the authority imposing the restriction, contact information, again, a broader range of guidelines for how to put together this sort of note beyond what's in RDA. And then some examples. The last element in this core minimal set for describing archival materials is the language and script. This is included in RDA in 6.11, but again, looking at that 4-part model for describing materials, this is an element related to the expression, which again may introduce some confusion for archivists trying to use these rules. The guidelines in 6.11 call for recording languages from a controlled list, recording multiple languages where those appear, and then the LC policy statement ties those entries to the MARC code list. DACS, again, builds on that slightly to require that the scripts used also be recorded as part of the description, whether you're using a Latin script, a Cyrillic script, or some other script. So bringing that all together now, a core RDA Core DACS minimal record using these guidelines would include the elements shown in this example. The title, the date of production, the extent, the content type, a scope content note, restrictions on access statement, the name and location of the repository, a identifier, the language material, as shown in the fixed field at the top, and so on. To quickly go through Archival creators, RDA does include expanded options for creating descriptions of creators. It uses ISAR-CPF, or it uses FRAD as its basis. FRAD itself is informed by ISAR-CPF, and so a lot of the archival concerns that have developed over the years are now included in RDA. One of the other things from ISAR that was included were families as an entity, a creator entity, in addition to persons and corporate bodies. DACS, for its part, being based on ISAR-CPF, includes similar guidelines for creating descriptions of creators. DACS, in parallel with RDA, also includes information on the recording access points, although that is not something that I'd like to focus on today. In the end, though, even though similar guidelines exist between the two sets of rules, it seems as though there's still a slightly different perspective between the RDA guidelines and requirements versus what's required in DACS. DACS, for its part, includes its guidelines in the context of providing context. According to Principle 8 of DACS, the creators of archival materials need to be described as much as the materials themselves, so that people will be able to understand how those materials relate to their creator and how the creator related to its own broader context. Looking at the requirements in RDA, RDA includes a broad list of elements that states that states as part of its core requirements that only elements that are applicable and readily ascertainable should be recorded, and provides the option of recording many of those different elements as part of the access point rather than recording them as separate elements. It also requires the recording of an identifier and source citations. DACS currently does not include a minimal required set, although ISAR-CPF does. It truly is a minimal set, though, but one specific case where it differs with these rules, or with the rules in RDA, is that it requires dates to be recorded as a separate element in addition to an access point. Again, there are a number of new elements provided for identifying persons, including dates, gender, place of birth, place of death, occupation, biographical information, and so on. For corporate bodies, there's a similar list of separate elements that can be recorded. And again, one main difference between, or one main addition to RDA from AACR2 was the inclusion of families. DACS had previously had its own rules for creating name headings for families, although these were fairly similar to those used by the Library of Congress subject headings, where it would just be the name of the family with the term family added on, so Taylor family in the example there. RDA allows for much greater specificity and differentiation, so that you can say this is this specific Weir family, this is the family of Robert Walter Weir. and not some other weird family where you would run into that sort of problem with the earlier DACS rules. For families, again, there are a number of other elements that can be recorded separate from the heading itself, the type of family, associated dates and places, and so on. One of the other areas of expansion in RDA is recording the relationships between entities as part of an authority record. Predecessor and successor bodies, of course, could have been recorded earlier, but more complex or other types of relationships can now be recorded. Hierarchical, superior-subordinate relationships, progenitor, and so on. How this would look in an authority record, again, being able to clearly label what the relationship was. So this, in the top example, its the predecessor body for that, for the Salt Lake and Ogden Railway is clearly defined. In the second example, its successor is described. For hierarchical relationships, this is particularly useful in cases where subordination in the heading doesn't make clear what relationships are. So, for example, the Harold B. Lee Library can now be clearly linked to Brigham Young University as its superior body, and then the inverse relationship could also be recorded. For authors with or writing under different identities, these identities can again be clearly defined. So this is the real identity of this author, and this is an alternative identity instead of a generic. See also sort of heading. But other types of relationships can also be recorded. A founder relationship, products of mergers, and so on can now be recorded as part of an authority record. But still, looking at how this all comes together in an authority record, this being a core minimal record, the only thing that is required is the heading itself, assuming that other information wasn't immediately available. But applying the ICE-RCPF guidelines, I've included the date as a separate element, even though it has been recorded as part of the heading itself. So, just quickly in conclusion, for archivists, RDA provides greater opportunities for recording characteristics and attributes of archival materials, and especially their creators. Archivists for a long time have been interested in recording a broader range of information about the creators of archival materials, and because of RDA, in part because of RDA's its foundations and the connections between ICE-RCPF, for example, and FRAD, now RDA is allowing us to be able to record a lot more information in authority records. For librarians, though, that are looking at RDA as their core descriptive standard, hopefully it's been clear that DACS provides much more information as well as a wider range of examples on how to apply those rules for describing archival materials. And I hope that as we move into the future that archives and libraries will continue to collaborate to build standards that will be mutually inform each other and be able to be applied across communities so that we'll be able to share and make these sorts of descriptions available to the wider community. So I'm sorry that was a little rushed, but Jane, I think that's the end of my slides. So.
Okay, thank you, Cory. There are some questions for you to answer, and I think the first one is for you to comment on. It is, you used mark 090 field, for example, for manuscript 4, but our catalog indexes 090 for Library of Congress classification. We use the 099 field for non-LC based call numbers. So I don't know if you want to comment on that or.
In my examples, those were based on our own local practice. I believe the 09X, all 090 through 099 are reserved for local call numbers. It's just our own practice here at BYU to use the 090 instead of 099, but I think that's a local decision.
Okay. Next, you have a request to go back to the slide about persons and corporate bodies elements. I don't know if you can, but, oh, you can.
Okay. So there's the persons. Again, it's a wide range of information that can be recorded from date information in standard formats, gender, locations, affiliations of the person to organizations, but language, profession, or occupation. We've now been approved to use the 678 field for recording a brief biographical note, as well as identifiers. Switching over to corporate bodies, again, places, locations, associated institutions, language, corporate body, field of activity or functions. Again, the 678 for corporate histories, and then an identifier.
Okay. Another question, are those successor and predecessor names or entities?
That is a very good question. It's something that right now DACS is currently under review with a revision due out next year. It's something that we're struggling with too. According to RDA, which follows the ASCR2 provisions, anytime an entity changes its name, you create a new entry. And so if you translate that into authority records as being tied to entities, basically it's a new entity every time the organization changes its name. I know archivists go back and forth on that. A lot of archivists would prefer to have that division based on something more definitive than just a name change. But those examples are based on those current RDA rules of a name change being indicative of a change in the entity.
Okay, well, I'm sorry, I think that's all we have time for right now. I'm to remind you that all the participants are to get Cory's slides, and any questions that Cory didn't have time to answer, and there are a few, he will answer them offline, and those will also be sent to you. So hopefully all your questions will be answered. So anyway, let's see. All right. Okay, one moment. I just wanted to thank everyone for coming. And we hope you found today's session useful. You will receive a short online evaluation form. Please take a few minutes to respond to the questions and return the form to us, because your comments are very valuable and they help the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee plan new courses. And I want to thank Cory also for sharing his tips about RDA with DACS for us this afternoon. This last slide shows more ALCTS courses coming up in June. We hope you will join us for one or more. I would also like to thank Wade Wyckoff for providing technical support for today's webinar, and also Julie Reese and Alyssa Novak of the ALCTS office. Their support makes it possible for us to present these webinars smoothly. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and we hope you will participate in other ALCTS offerings again in the future.